You are standing under a tree somewhere in prehistoric Africa. No grocery store, no refrigerator, no bartender with a tiny mustache asking if you want something smoky, floral, or dangerously experimental. There is just you, the sun, the dirt, the insects, and a pile of fruit on the ground that has clearly been there a little too long. It smells sweet, but not normal sweet, not fresh fruit sweet. More like something has gone wrong in a way your brain does not fully understand yet, because chemistry has not been invented, biology has not been invented, and the phrase, "maybe don't eat that," is probably still several 100,000 years away from becoming official group policy. The fruit is soft. Some of it is leaking. Tiny bubbles are forming in the juice. Flies are extremely interested in it, which should probably be a warning, but ancient humans were not exactly living in a world full of clean food choices. Sometimes dinner was a perfectly roasted animal. Sometimes dinner was a root you found after watching another animal eat it and not immediately die. So someone tries it. And this, right here, might be one of the most underrated moments in human history. Not because this person invented wine. They did not. Not because they understood fermentation. They absolutely did not. But because for the first time, or one of the first times, a human ancestor may have eaten something that contained alcohol and noticed that the world felt slightly different afterward. Maybe the fire seemed warmer. Maybe the group seemed funnier. Maybe the person who usually annoyed everyone suddenly became almost tolerable for 20 minutes. Maybe someone laughed too hard at a noise that was not funny. Maybe someone stood up too fast and immediately learned a new fact about balance. And that raises a surprisingly serious question. Did ancient humans get drunk? Not modern drunk, not wedding reception drunk, not texting your ex from a bathroom stall drunk. We are not talking about beer pong in the Stone Age or some hunter-gatherer named Grug inventing the first bad decision. We are asking something much older and much more interesting. Before cities, before writing, before money, before agriculture, before anyone had ever looked at a pile of grain and thought, I could turn this into either bread or a problem. Did humans already know what alcohol was? And if they did, was it an accident? A rare mistake? A weird natural event that happened once in a while? Or was alcohol part of human life much earlier than we usually imagine? Because here's the thing. Most people think alcohol begins with civilization. They imagine ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greek wine cups, Roman banquets, monks brewing beer, taverns, vineyards, barrels, festivals, laws, taxes, and eventually some guy at a party explaining the difference between whiskey and whiskey, even though nobody asked. But alcohol itself is much older than all of that. Alcohol does not need civilization. It does not need pottery. It does not need farms, cities, temples, kings, priests, or someone in linen robes carefully labeling a wine jar. Alcohol only needs three things: sugar, yeast, and time. And nature had all three long before humans had anything. Fruit ripens, fruit falls, yeast lands on it. The sugars begin to break down. Ethanol appears. No human planning required. No recipe, no brewery, no sacred ceremony. Just biology quietly doing what biology does, turning sweetness into something strange. Which means that long before the first person intentionally made a drink, our ancestors were already living in a world where alcohol existed naturally. It was in fallen fruit. It was in tree hollows filled with fermented juice. It may have been in stored plant material that sat too long in the wrong conditions. It was not common like water, but it was not imaginary either. And early humans noticed things. That is basically our entire brand as a species. We notice patterns, then we become unbearable about them. This fruit smells different. This fruit tastes different. This fruit makes people act different. Last time we ate the soft, sweet stuff near that tree, everyone got loud, then sleepy, then one guy tried to dance and fell into a bush. That is not science yet, but it is observation. And observation is where everything begins. So the real story of ancient humans and alcohol does not start in a palace. It does not start in a vineyard. It does not start with a clay cup in the hand of a king. It starts on the ground, with overripe fruit, wild yeast, a hungry animal, and a brain curious enough to connect cause and effect. But before we can ask whether ancient humans intentionally made alcohol, we have to ask something even stranger. Why could they handle it at all? Because alcohol is not exactly a friendly substance. To a lot of animals, ethanol is not a fun little bonus. It is a toxin. Too much of it disrupts the nervous system, ruins coordination, impairs judgment, and generally turns survival into a group project that your body is losing. And yet, humans are unusually good at processing it. Not perfectly, not safely in unlimited amounts, but compared to many animals, our bodies are surprisingly prepared for this molecule, which means alcohol was probably not some brand new surprise that appeared when humans invented farming. Our relationship with it may go much deeper, deep enough that the story does not begin with humans at all. It begins with fruit, and, weirdly enough, with monkeys. And yes, monkeys, which is a sentence that should make any scientific explanation immediately more trustworthy. Because before humans were brewing beer, before anyone was storing grain, before anyone had invented cups, jars, farms, or the deeply suspicious phrase artisanal fermentation, there were primates in forests eating fruit. A lot of fruit. And fruit, if you leave it alone long enough, does something very interesting. It begins to change. The sugars inside it start breaking down. Wild yeast gets involved. The smell shifts. The texture softens. And tiny amounts of ethanol appear. Not enough to turn the forest into a nightclub. Not enough for a chimpanzee to start making emotional speeches at midnight. But enough that the fruit is no longer just fruit. It has become fruit with a chemical side quest. And here is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. For an animal living in a forest, finding ripe fruit is a big deal. Ripe fruit means sugar. Sugar means calories. Calories mean survival. And in a world where food is scattered, seasonal, and constantly being stolen by everything with a mouth, anything that helps you find ripe fruit faster is extremely useful. Ethanol has a smell. That smell travels through the air. So imagine you are an ancient primate moving through a dense forest. You cannot see every fruit from a distance. Leaves are in the way, branches are in the way, other animals are in the way. The forest is basically nature's most annoying grocery store, except everything is alive and some of it wants to bite you. But then you smell something. Sweet, sharp, slightly wrong. A signal moving through the air from fruit that is very ripe, maybe overripe, maybe already fermenting. If you follow that smell, you might find food. And if your cousin ignores that smell because it seems weird, congratulations. You just got lunch, and your cousin got evolutionary disappointment. This is the basic idea behind what biologist Robert Dudley called the drunken monkey hypothesis. The idea is not that monkeys were swinging through the trees looking for happy hour. The idea is that our attraction to alcohol may have very old roots in fruit-eating primates using the smell of ethanol as a clue for finding high-energy food. That is the important part. Alcohol did not begin as a party signal. It may have begun as a food signal. A tiny, invisible message from the forest saying, calories are over here. And modern research has made this idea harder to laugh off. Scientists studying wild black-handed spider monkeys in Panama found that fruit the monkeys were actually eating contained measurable alcohol, often around 1 to 2%. That is weak compared to modern drinks, obviously. Nobody is confusing a fermented forest fruit with a glass of whiskey. But it is real ethanol inside real fruit being eaten by real primates. Which means the relationship between primates and alcohol is not hypothetical in the silly sense. It is happening, right now, in nature, without bottles, without bars, without anyone saying, I only drink socially. Now, does this mean monkeys are drunk all day? No. And this is where we have to be careful because the internet loves turning biology into nonsense. A monkey eating fermented fruit is not the same thing as a person drinking 6 cocktails. The concentrations are usually low. The food matters. The dose matters. The body size matters. The speed of consumption matters. Biology, as always, refuses to be simple just because a headline wants it to be. But it does mean something very important. It means alcohol was part of the natural environment long before humans deliberately made it. And our bodies seem to carry the memory of that. One of the strongest pieces of evidence comes from an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase 4, or ADH4, which helps break down ethanol. Researchers looking at primate evolution found that a major change in this enzyme appeared roughly 10 million years ago in the lineage leading toward humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas. That change made the enzyme much better at processing ethanol. 10 million years ago. Let that sit there for a second. That is not before agriculture. That is not before civilization. That is before humans. That is before Homo sapiens. That is back when our ancestors were not sitting around fires telling stories. They were still somewhere in the long, messy, hairy, pre-human chapter of the family album. And this timing matters. Around that period, some ape ancestors were spending more time on the ground. And what is on the ground? Fallen fruit. Fruit in trees gets eaten quickly. Fruit on the ground gets bruised, cracked, invaded by yeast, warmed by the sun, and fermented. A ground-feeding ape would have encountered more of it. And if that ape could process ethanol better than its competitors, it could eat food that might make others sick, or at least uncomfortable. That is not a drinking habit yet. That is survival. It is not a toast. It is not a celebration. It is not a bad decision at a wedding. It is an animal finding calories in a difficult world and having a body just capable enough to handle the chemical mess that came with them. So by the time actual humans appear, the stage is already set. We did not invent alcohol from nothing. We inherited a world where alcohol already existed. We inherited noses that could notice it. We inherited brains that could remember its effects. And we inherited bodies that were, at least compared to many animals, unusually prepared to deal with it. Which means the first human who ate fermented fruit was not stepping into completely unknown territory. Their body had been rehearsing for that moment for millions of years. But eating fermented fruit by accident is one thing. Making alcohol on purpose is something else entirely. And that is where the story takes its next strange turn. But eating fermented fruit by accident is one thing. Making alcohol on purpose is something else. That is the moment alcohol stops being only a natural accident and becomes part of human behavior. Someone has to collect plants, crush them, soak them, store them, and leave the mixture long enough for it to change. Ancient humans did not know about yeast. They did not know about ethanol. They did not understand fermentation as chemistry. They only knew the pattern. The mash bubbled, the smell changed, the taste changed, and after people consumed it, people changed too. For humans, that was enough to remember. The hard part is proving it thousands of years later. Ancient alcohol almost never survives. Liquids disappear. Wooden containers rot. Baskets and animal skins decay. So archaeologists usually have to work with indirect evidence. Stone tools, residues, plant particles, starch grains, and traces left inside ancient mortars. One of the most important places in this story is Raqefet Cave on Mount Carmel in what is now Israel. Around 13,000 years ago, people from the Natufian culture used this cave. The Natufians lived before full agriculture. They hunted and gathered, but they were also becoming more settled. They collected wild grains, used grinding stones, stored food, and buried their dead in special places. They were not farmers yet. They were not a civilization yet. But their world was already changing. Inside Raqefet Cave, researchers found stone mortars carved into the rock. These mortars appear to have been used to process plant material, including grains. Microscopic evidence suggests that some of this processing was connected to fermentation. In simple terms, these people may have been making a beer-like fermented food or drink around 13,000 years ago. Not modern beer, no bottles, no foam, no clear golden liquid. This was probably thick, cloudy, and closer to fermented grain porridge than the drink people imagine today. It may have been somewhere between food and alcohol, but that is exactly why it matters. For ancient humans, food and drink were not always separate categories. A fermented grain mash could provide calories. It could be shared by a group. It could mark an important moment, and it could contain alcohol. The context of Raqefet Cave is important too. This was not just a random food preparation area. The cave was connected with burials and ritual activity. So this beer-like drink may have been used during ceremonies, feasts, or gatherings around the dead. That changes the picture. Early alcohol was not necessarily about entertainment. It may have been about ritual. It may have been about memory. It may have been about bringing people together. This does not mean alcohol created agriculture by itself. That would be too simple. Humans moved toward farming for many reasons: climate, population, wild grains, storage, and settlement. But alcohol may have been one piece of that transition. By 13,000 years ago, some ancient humans were probably no longer only finding fermented fruit by accident. They were processing grains in ways that could produce fermentation. They did not understand the science, but they understood the result. Take plants, crush them, soak them, let them change, share the result. That is the turning point. Alcohol had moved from the forest floor into human culture, and once that happened, later civilizations would take it much further. But before civilizations took alcohol further, something important had already happened. Alcohol had entered prehistoric social life. Not city life, not temple life, not written history. Prehistoric life. This is the period before kings, before money, before official laws, before large cities, and before anyone was writing down how much beer belonged to which worker. And in that world, alcohol probably had a very different meaning. For a prehistoric group, making a fermented drink or fermented grain mash was not casual. It required time, effort, and planning. People had to collect plants. They had to process them. They had to store them. They had to wait. That already tells us something. This was not the same as eating a random fermented fruit from the ground. This was organized behavior. And organized behavior usually means social behavior. A group could gather wild grains during the right season. They could grind them with stone tools. They could mix them with water. They could leave the mixture in a container, a hollow, a skin, a basket lined with something, or a stone mortar. They might not control fermentation perfectly, but they could notice when it worked. The smell changed, the texture changed, the taste changed, the effect changed. And if the result became part of an important gathering, people would remember how to repeat it. That is why prehistoric alcohol was probably not just about getting drunk. It was about events. A normal meal feeds the body. A shared fermented drink can mark a moment. That moment could be a seasonal gathering. It could be a feast after a successful hunt. It could be connected to a burial. It could be part of a ritual where people remembered the dead, strengthened alliances, or brought separate groups together. This matters because prehistoric people did not live as isolated individuals. Survival depended on relationships. You needed people to hunt with you, gather with you, protect children, share food, exchange information, and help during hard seasons. Anything that helped a group feel united had value. Food did that. Fire did that. Stories did that. Rituals did that. And fermented drinks may have done that too. Alcohol changes behavior. Even in small amounts, it can make people more relaxed, louder, more emotional, more willing to speak, sing, dance, or take part in a shared experience. In a dangerous world, that could be risky. But in a controlled ritual setting, it could also be useful. The key word is controlled. Prehistoric alcohol was probably weak compared to many modern drinks. It was likely inconsistent. One batch might be stronger, another might barely work. Some mixtures may have been more like sour porridge than a drink. But even weak alcohol could matter if the group was not drinking it every day. A rare fermented mash at a special gathering would feel different from ordinary food. It would have a memory attached to it. People might not say, "This contains ethanol." They might say, in their own way, "This is the food we make when we gather," or "This is the drink for the dead," or "This is what we share when different families come together." That is how chemistry becomes culture. And this also helps explain why alcohol may have become important before full agriculture. If people wanted fermented grain mixtures for rituals or feasts, then wild grains became more valuable. Storage became more valuable. Grinding stones became more valuable. Returning to the same place at the right season became more valuable. That does not mean alcohol invented farming, but it may have encouraged behaviors that pointed in the same direction as farming: collecting plants, storing food, processing grains, planning ahead, and gathering people in fixed places. This is the important prehistoric picture. Alcohol was not simply discovered once. It was learned. People learned which plants worked better. They learned which mixtures changed. They learned how long to wait. They learned when the result was useful. And most importantly, They learned that fermented food or drink could change the feeling of a group. That makes alcohol different from an ordinary tool. A stone blade cuts, a spear kills, a basket carries. But alcohol changes the social atmosphere. It changes how people feel together. For prehistoric humans, that may have been its real power. Not entertainment, not nightlife, not modern drinking culture. A shared fermented mash could turn a gathering into a ceremony. It could turn food into memory. It could turn a group of people into a stronger group. And by the time villages and later civilizations appeared, humans were not starting from zero. They already understood the basic pattern. Plants could be transformed. Time could change food. Fermentation could create something special. And when people shared it, the group changed too. So before alcohol became part of ancient economies, temples, and written records, it was already something older, a prehistoric social tool, born from plants, time, memory, and people gathering together. So, did ancient humans get drunk? The honest answer is yes, but probably not in the way we usually imagine. They were not drinking modern beer. They were not pouring wine into cups. They were not sitting in a prehistoric tavern after a long day of chasing antelope and complaining about management. For most of human prehistory, alcohol would have been weaker, rarer, and much less predictable than it is today. Sometimes it was probably accidental. A person eats overripe fruit. A group finds fermented plant material. Someone drinks from a mixture that sat too long. The effect is mild, strange, memorable, and maybe a little confusing. Other times, especially later in prehistory, it may have been intentional. People collected plants, they crushed grains, they soaked them, they waited. They shared the result. And if that result contained enough alcohol, then yes, some ancient humans could have become intoxicated. But the important part is not simply that they could get drunk. The important part is what alcohol meant in their world. Today, people often think of alcohol as recreation, a drink after work, a party, a celebration, a bad decision with better lighting. But prehistoric humans lived in a very different reality. Food was seasonal, danger was real, groups were small, memory mattered, ritual mattered, trust mattered. So if alcohol appeared in that world, it probably became important because it did something social. It changed the feeling of a gathering. A fermented mash was not just calories. It could become a shared experience. It could mark a special moment. It could separate ordinary eating from ceremony. That ceremony might be connected to the dead. It might happen after a successful hunt. It might happen when different families or groups came together. It might happen at a seasonal camp when wild grains, fruits, or honey were available. And that is why alcohol fits so well into prehistoric life. Not because ancient humans were trying to escape boredom, but because humans are extremely sensitive to shared emotion. We gather around fire, we tell stories, we sing, we dance, we eat together, we remember the dead together, and sometimes we transform ordinary plants into something that makes the group feel different. That is the deeper story. Alcohol began as chemistry. Sugar met yeast. Time passed. Fermentation happened. But humans turned that chemistry into culture. They did not need to understand molecules to understand results. They only needed to notice patterns. This fruit smells different. This mash tastes different. This gathering feels different. People remember what changes them, and once they remember, they repeat it. That is how a natural accident can become a tradition. Still, we should not exaggerate it. Prehistoric alcohol was probably not available all the time. It was not standardized. It was not strong like modern spirits. It was not something people could buy, store in glass bottles, or consume whenever they wanted. Some batches may have barely contained alcohol. Some may have spoiled. Some may have tasted terrible. Some may have worked once and failed the next time. But that unpredictability may have made it even more special. A rare, successful fermentation would stand out. It would be remembered. It would be connected to the people, place, and event around it. So the answer to the original question is not just, yes, ancient humans got drunk. The better answer is this. Ancient humans encountered alcohol long before civilization. Their bodies were already prepared for it because primates had been dealing with fermented fruit for millions of years. Later, prehistoric people learned that plants could be processed and left to change. And by at least the end of the Ice Age, Some groups were probably making beer-like fermented food or drink before full agriculture. That means alcohol was not invented by cities. Cities inherited it. Civilization did not create the human relationship with alcohol. It organized it. The roots are older than writing, older than kings, older than money, older than bars, vineyards, breweries, and clay tablets. The roots are in fruit falling from trees, in wild grains crushed with stone, in caves, in seasonal camps, in burials, in people gathering together and realizing that some foods do more than feed the body. They change the moment. So when we ask whether ancient humans got drunk, we are really asking something bigger. When did humans first learn that nature could alter the mind? When did a strange taste become a remembered effect? When did a shared food become a ritual? And when did chemistry become part of human culture? The answer is probably very early. Long before civilization gave alcohol names, rules, taxes, gods, and containers, prehistoric humans were already meeting it in simpler forms. Sometimes by accident, sometimes by experiment, sometimes around the dead, sometimes around the fire. And maybe, after drinking a weak fermented mash from crushed plants, someone laughed a little louder, sang a little longer, or felt the group around them a little more strongly. They did not know the word alcohol. They did not know the word fermentation. They did not know what yeast was. But they knew something had changed. And for humans, that has always been enough to remember.